So welcome one and all to the final event in the 2024-25 CAMS lecture series, Connected Histories of the Ancient Mediterranean and Near East. At this concluding event of the year, I would like to take a moment to thank my colleague and my co-organizer, Professor Rebecca Wang, for all of her help in setting up the events of this year. The theme has been Connected Histories of the Ancient Mediterranean and Near East. The series has intended to showcase some trailblazing research that speaks across the disciplinary divide between the study of the classical cultures of ancient Greece and Rome on the one hand, and the civilizations of the ancient Near East on the other, a research concern which is very near and dear to our heart here in CAMS. We've heard a number of great talks this year. We had Professor Eric Klein kick us off with the talk on the collapse of the interconnected Eastern Mediterranean interstate system in the late Bronze Age. Rob Chaffee talked about the place of Egypt and Ethiopia as sites of resistance in the Roman cultural imaginary and Greek novels. Supratik Barali spoke on Arsacid's strategies of imperial domination at either end of their massive empire, Central Asia in the east and the Middle Eastern steppe in the west. And finally, Alice Mandel spoke to us not long ago on scribal practices and institutional record keeping in the Amarna letters. We are delighted today to have Professor Cate Bonesho of UCLA to give the concluding talk in this year's series, and to introduce her more fully and amply, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Professor Daniel Falk. Daniel, I'll just give you this mic as well. Oh, keep it anywhere near you.
Okay. Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Bonesho. We haven't met before, but met over lunch, and it was delightful. Catherine Bonesho is an assistant professor in early Judaism in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. She received her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2018 for a dissertation on foreign holidays and festivals as representative of identity in rabbinic literature. This is a fascinating study of the ways that rabbinic literature represents Roman holidays for political aims and to construct identity, both the self and the other, through detailed analysis of the rabbinic tractate Avodah Zarah. She shows how foreign holidays are used in polemic against idolatry, but also to navigate involvement in the imperial economy and as markers of identity, Rome versus Israel. I look forward to seeing this appear as a monograph. I don't know where that is in the stages.
Yeah, it's actually should be finishing up to submit by the end of June.
Oh, fantastic. She is already at work on her second monograph on representations of Greek and Roman rulers in ancient Jewish literature. And she has also published numerous journal articles and book chapters. There's a common theme running through her research, as is already obvious from that, investigating the ways that ancient Jews lived under Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern imperial domination and the representation of the other. She's also published on Palmyrene Aramaic inscriptions as one of the founding members of the Wisconsin Palmyrene Aramaic Inscription Project. The excellence of her research has been recognized and supported by a Rome Prize Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome and a Frankel Fellowship from the University of Michigan. She serves as one of the editors of the journal Currents in Biblical Literature and is co-editor of an upcoming special edition on Aramaic language and literature in the Journal for the Study of the Pseudepigrapha. Her combination of research in language, literature, and cultures across the ancient world makes her a perfect fit for this year's CAMS lecture series. Her lecture is entitled The Rabbis Queens, Cleopatra, and Zenobia in Talmudic Literature. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Bonesho.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And before beginning, I'd like to thank Jake, Rebecca, and everyone I've met today and will meet for the lovely invitation to speak as part of this lecture series. It's a pleasure to just be here to see colleagues and to meet new ones. I'm delighted to speak today on the theme of connected histories of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. My interest in the study of antiquity started in classics. I was a classics major. in undergraduate. And I accidentally fell into the study of ancient Judaism. Truly, I had to take organic chemistry, and Greek was offered at the same time. So I had to take another ancient language, and Hebrew was open. And that's where my interest in ancient Judaism and the ancient Near East was sparked. So I am more than excited about the increased study of the intersections between these two areas. Delighted to be part of it and really appreciate the kind of work that's being done in a department like yours. So, who was Cleopatra VII Philopater? The 1st century BCE Egyptian queen has been described in a myriad of ways. In many depictions, ancient and modern, she is a dangerous and hypersexualized woman of the other. But this is not always the case. For example, in women's cosmetic advertisements from the 1920s and 30s in the United States, Cleopatra is not a dangerous other. Instead, she is depicted as an ideal white American woman, confident and royal, ready to spend money on cosmetics and clothing. A different African portrait of Cleopatra emerges in Frank Ocean's 2012 song, Pyramids, in which Cleopatra is mourned as the lost Egyptian queen. To Ocean, Cleopatra is, quote, the jewel of Africa, end quote. So who is Cleopatra? Well, it depends on who we're asking. So maybe it's better to ask ourselves, who could Cleopatra be, and what could she do for different communities? These are the kinds of questions that I ask in my second book, tentatively titled Playing with Caesars in Ancient Judaism. I did not realize that was a pun until I said it out loud the first time at a conference last year. Early Jewish literature of both the Second Temple and Rabbinic periods provide many nuanced and fantastical depictions of the Greek and Roman kings, queens, and Caesars who ruled over ancient Jewish communities. Some descriptions of these rulers are meant to critique Greek and Roman hegemony, others to valorize, and still others to assert the authority or goals of the Jewish authors. Tales of Alexander the Great, Nero, Cleopatra, and Zenobia, among others, are more than just historical narratives or references, which is often how they've been treated in scholarship. Rather, many stories of these rulers, often influenced by broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions, highlight the utility of portraits of power for the prerogatives of ancient Jewish authors and communities as they critique, praise, or ultimately reimagine their worlds. My talk today on Cleopatra and Zenobia is but one of this book's case studies and focuses on Cleopatra and the late antique corpus of classical rabbinic literature and the role of Zenobia, the famous queen of Palmyra, as a model for thinking about rabbinic interactions with both queens. So let's ask ourselves again, who could Cleopatra be and what could she do? Specifically for the ancient rabbis of the 2nd to 6th century CE about. Before getting into the actual text itself, I should note that some of the texts are traumatic on a number of levels, describing enslavement, sexual violence, and medical experimentations without by force. Classical rabbinic literature describes or refers to Cleopatra only 4 times in its very large corpus, 3 of which are found in the Babylonian Talmud. These passages differ in numerous ways from the often polemical accounts one might be more familiar with from Roman antiquity. A Talmudic passage from the Babylonian Talmud, Nida 30b, expands on a tradition from the Tosefta and describes Cleopatra's medical experiments to determine the length of embryo gestation. Another depiction is also found in the Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin 90b to 91a, in which Cleopatra and the famous Rabbi Meir discuss whether people will be resurrected naked or clothed. The final passage in which Cleopatra appears is found in the Babylonian Talmud of Tractate on Avodah Zarah, or foreign worship, which briefly mentions her defeat by the Romans, possibly the Battle of Actium, and the Roman annexation of Egypt. Now, scholarship on these passages has often focused on rabbinic legal reasoning or on reconstructing rabbinic medical knowledge, with little discussion of the figure of Cleopatra herself. Essentially, she's but a detail. Some studies have utilized a particular positivistic approach to these texts. For example, in his 1911 study of medicine in ancient Jewish literature, Julius Prus read the discussions of Cleopatra's experiments as evidence for the performance of autopsies in antiquity. Another example includes the work of Giuseppe Veltri, who argues that the Talmud's reference to Cleopatra's defeat by the Romans in Avodah Zarah simply acts as a temporal indication of the date of the foundation of the Roman Empire around the Battle of Actium. However, recent scholarship on dialogues between the rabbis and other groups in rabbinic literature, focusing particularly on the tractate of the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin, has moved away from these type of positivist historical readings, or at least only these types of readings. Instead of concentrating on the question of whether the conversations between rabbis and Romans and other groups are historical, Richard Kellman, Christine Hayes, Jenny Labens, and others have argued that it is more productive to focus on questions of how these non-rabbinic figures and rabbinic dialogues with them reflect rabbinic reasoning and prerogatives. In these studies, the character of Cleopatra moves beyond a simple historical detail. She forms part of rabbinic reasoning. However, too often in these studies, Cleopatra's persona and reception disappear. She becomes merely another non-Jewish ruler in dialogue with rabbis. Okay. Oops. Okay. Rivka Almer has taken an alternative path and has investigated the passages that mention Cleopatra as a whole in the most extensive study of Cleopatra in rabbinic literature and Egypt in rabbinic literature thus far. Through a focus on representations of Egypt in the Midrashim, she argues that rabbinic sources exhibit similarities with Roman depictions of the queen, particularly their emphasis on her Egyptianness. In Ulmer's view, Cleopatra is negatively depicted in rabbinic texts because she is used for, quote, the ideological and religious presence of Egypt as representing the other, end quote. Essentially, by deferring to Roman and other negative portraits of the queen, one tends to read references to Cleopatra as negative. Ulmer's work has certainly illuminated the ways in which classical rabbinic literature draws on ancient Mediterranean traditions of Cleopatra. However, I argue that a contextualization of rabbinic discussions of Cleopatra with other sources, particularly late ancient Near Eastern representations, including that of the Palmyrene queen Zenobia, suggests that Cleopatra is referred to in some passages not just because she's an Egyptian, but because of her gender, expertise, and opposition to Rome. While scholarship on the ancient reception of Cleopatra has typically relied on Roman and other sources that more often than not polemically treat the queen, today I hope to show how reorienting the study of the reception of Cleopatra in rabbinic literature toward late ancient sources, especially those of the Near East, can illuminate rabbinic descriptions of the queen and show us who she can be for these communities beyond just the Roman enemy. So, what do our ancient sources tell us about Cleopatra? Well after her and Mark Antony's loss to Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and her death in 30 BCE, Roman authors continued to exhibit an unrelenting fixation with the queen and used her to promote a variety of political goals, most notably the authorization of Roman imperial power, particularly that of the Julio-Claudian emperors. The first-century Roman poets Virgil, Propertius, and Ovid often denigrate Cleopatra as part of their participation in Augustan propaganda. I've provided a quote here from Propertius describing her, let's say, in negative terms for the Romans. Roman authors like Cassius Dio, Lucan, and Plutarch also expend significant energy on the queen and tend to characterize her as a representation of the so-called East, a paragon of otherness whose dangerous sexuality threatens the very Romanness of Caesar himself. Other Roman attempts to degrade Cleopatra include the erasure of her royal status, especially found in the Augustan literature. She is often left unnamed or is merely referred to as the Egyptian wife or Aegyptia conux, or merely woman, mulier, or femina. However, our ancient sources don't just denigrate Cleopatra. Some also emphasize her intelligence and even her scholarship. Even as they were critiquing her, a few Roman sources praised the queen's intellect, such as Plutarch's description of Cleopatra's acumen, especially her language skills, which we all hope to emulate. In later texts, her expertise in scientific discussions grow, particularly in the field of medicine. For example, some late antique texts, including the 7th century writings of Paul of Aegina, pseudonymously ascribe scientific knowledge to Cleopatra, specifically knowledge of medicine, cosmetics, and gynecology. These traditions of Cleopatra as medical expert likely build on a brief reference in one of Galen's works to a certain Cleopatra, and this is a certain Cleopatra, not likely the Queen Cleopatra, whose work contains remedies for hair loss, dandruff, and other skin abnormalities. Now again, it is unlikely that the Cleopatra mentioned by Galen is actually our Queen Cleopatra, but is instead a physician associated with the Egyptian court in the 1st century BCE or CE. However, even as it is doubtful that this early Galenic reference refers to Queen Cleopatra, the 7th, there are multiple Queen Cleopatras, later texts identify Cleopatra, the medical expert from Galen, with our Queen Cleopatra, making the queen an expert in medical knowledge, at least in late antique and medieval traditions. Very similar to what Tal Ilan calls unification, where different women are merged into a single persona in the Babylonian Talmud. In many late ancient texts, Galen's Cleopatra, other Ptolemaic Cleopatras, and Cleopatra the 7th become part of the same persona, a persona which is then logically attributed to the most famous Cleopatra, the last Ptolemy. This sort of unification seems to be found in the writings of the late ancient Byzantine physicians Aetius and Amida and Paul of Aegina, who both cite cosmetic medical material attributed to Cleopatra, with Aetius and Amida explicitly citing a recipe of Queen Cleopatra. That's what the manuscript shows in Greek here. Okay. This sort of pseudonymity of attributing medical and other scientific traditions to Cleopatra is found in other late antique as well as other medieval texts. For example, Cleopatra is associated with a treatise on women's medicine titled De Morbis Mulierum, the compilations Gynecea Cleopatrae and Pisaria, as well as Greek writings on alchemy, many of which provide details that link these specific discussions with the queen herself. Medieval Arabic writers similarly emphasize Cleopatra's medical expertise and scholarship, including the 10th century historian Al-Mas'udi, who describes her books on cosmetics and medicine and their utility to physicians. Again, this is Queen Cleopatra, not just the random Cleopatra mentioned in Galen. These traditions of Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra, do not necessarily mean that Cleopatra herself practiced or experimented with medicine. And here I'd like to ad lib. We know not much about Hippocrates, right? But later texts are attributed to him and practices are attributed to him. This is basically happening with Cleopatra as well, just a couple centuries later. Cleopatra's fame in antiquity made her a productive source that ancient authors of a variety of traditions could utilize, draw from, and build on. As Rebecca Fleming argues, it is not the actual identity of a historical monarch that is generally being laid claim to here, just a more general and diffuse piece of action, some of her authority and aura. And it is what Fleming calls her authority and aura of Cleopatra that made her such a productive figure to be taken up by other late antique groups, including the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud. But to best understand the Babylonian Talmud's usage of Cleopatra, I would now like to turn to one of the more demonstrative examples of the co-opting of the figure of Cleopatra from another ancient Near Eastern group, the Palmyrines and their rebel queen Zenobia, as well as the ancient Jewish reception of Zenobia. Okay. Zenobia was a Palmyrene queen who, after the death of her husband Odaenathus, ruled a large part of the ancient Near East as part of her Palmyrene state, including Palestine, Syria, and parts of Egypt in the latter half of the 3rd century CE. Around 271, Zenobia openly rebels against Rome, declaring herself emperor instead of Aurelian. According to some of our sources, she did so while modeling her rule on Cleopatra. Unfortunately, one has to rely on non-Palmyrene accounts for description of Zenobia's appropriation of Cleopatra, particularly the often polemical accounts found in the Historia Augusta, a 4th to 5th century Roman text. However, I would agree with Nathaniel Andrade that makes sense that Zenobia would model herself on Cleopatra. So these passages of the Historia Augusta, which I'm not going to read aloud, I'm just going to review them, speak to Zenobia's appropriation of the persona of Cleopatra, most often attributed to their shared gender as women, their respective battles against Rome, and their shared Eastern origins. Zenobia does not merely claim to be a descendant of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies, but also uses Cleopatra's refusal to surrender as precedent for her own political and military strategies. At least according to the Historia Augusta, which again, we have to be cautious, Cleopatra acts as a model for Zenobia's response to Rome. Zenobia is described as Queen of the East or Regina Orientis, similar to the way Roman sources describe Cleopatra as representative of the East. You could think here of the Aeneid, was it book 1, where Augustus is described as taking Eastern spoils, spoilies Orientis. Overall, Zenobia's status as an Easterner and queen rebelling against Rome correlate to presentations of Cleopatra, and all these qualities and reinforce the polemical and political power of the persona and memory of Cleopatra in the late ancient Near East and Mediterranean. There are also other sources that describe, I think there's one other source that describes Zenobia's use of Cleopatra, Callinicus of Petra, but again, it's hard to tell how much we can rely on these sources. Now, one might ask, what does Zenobia have to do with the classical rabbis and the Talmuds? It's a fair question. One finds both literary as well as epigraphic evidence for Jewish communities' reception of Zenobia, as the Palmyrene queen ruled over Jewish communities before and during her conflict with Rome. We also find a statement from the late antique Christian figure Athanasius of Alexandria, who claims that Zenobia herself was Jewish or had converted to Judaism, although there's little evidence to support such a claim. Although scholarship on Jewish communities in Palmyra and Zenobia specifically is limited, those who have worked on it have often concluded that the ancient rabbis were hostile to Zenobia and Palmyra, particularly based on an interpretation of 2 passages in the Palestinian Talmud. For example, Javier Teixidor says, I am inclined to take Athanasius's testimony that Zenobia converted to Judaism literally and believe that she was a Jewish proselyte, which would explain why she had such a strained relationship with the rabbis. However, we don't know she had a strained relationship with the rabbis. And as I hope to show on the next few slides, rabbinic and other Jewish responses to the Palmyrene queen, at the very least, do not exhibit hostility, but actually show Jewish communities, like the rabbis, engaging with or remembering the famous non-Jewish ruler in the ancient Near East. And by the way, just because it's not negative doesn't mean it's positive. It just doesn't mean there's maybe a polemic against him. So it's at this point I'll turn to the only passage of the Talmud or rabbinic text that refers to Zenobia by name. Zenobia is mentioned in one passage from the Palestinian Talmud, translated here. In the narrative, which is at times confusing because there are extra characters that we don't really know who they are, 2 rabbis request that Queen Zenobia release a certain man named Zair Bar Hinena from imprisonment. Zenobia responds by immediately acknowledging God's wonders and eventually releases the rabbi's friend. This doesn't sound that negative to me. Though the motives for arresting Zair Bar Hinena and the identity of certain figures are unclear and again likely fictitious, the rabbis characterize Zenobia as knowledgeable of God and God's wondrous works. Furthermore, Zenobia, as a ruling queen, sides with the rabbis on the release of Zair Bar Hinena because eventually he's released. And this is actually maybe in distinction with the wicked actions of her husband, Odenathus. While it has been debated whether the rabbis in particular and Jewish communities more generally took kindly to Palmyra, it does not appear that there is any overt rabbinic antagonism to Zenobia. Indeed, in the passage here, she's a capable queen who acknowledges God and engages with 2 rabbinic sages. She is also described in the passage as the lone ruler explicitly called queen or Molktha, even while her husband Odaenathus, here referred to as Bar-Netzer, who often described himself in his own inscriptions that he commissioned as the King of Kings, is not listed as a king or any sort of official title. In my reading, we have a story of rabbis receiving a seemingly kind audience from the famous Palmyrene queen who ultimately releases their friend. Okay. In regard to Jewish communities more generally, who are not necessarily rabbinic, actually most likely not rabbinic, we have epigraphic evidence in Roman Palestine for a generally maybe positive view of Zenobia. At Beit She'arim, one finds a Jewish epitaph commissioned in Greek by a certain Jewish woman named Zenobia for her mother, complete with images of a menorah, shofar, and lulav, classic images found on Jewish funerary epitaphs. We similarly find a Greek epitaph for a Jewish man named Zenobius. Between the rabbinic tale of Zenobia as well as the inscriptions of Beit She'arim, it seems that the rabbis and other Jewish communities in antiquity were at the very least aware of Zenobia, because of course they were in part living under her rule. And some appear to have even sided with and maybe emulated her, or at least didn't have a problem with being named after her. And there are maybe a multitude of reasons for this, maybe because of her rebellion against Rome, or maybe she was just a popular ruler. I still see no indication of a negative rabbinic reception of her, though. So I now return to Cleopatra. Informed by Zenobia's use of the persona of Cleopatra, ancient Jewish encounters with and stories about Zenobia, as well as Cleopatra's rich reception history in late antiquity, I suggest that we re-examine the rabbinic passages that refer to Cleopatra because of what the Egyptian queen could represent to other late ancient Near Eastern groups. In what follows, I will show how the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud to draw from and co-opt traditions of Cleopatra in order to promote certain rabbinic concepts like resurrection and menstrual impurity, as well as to critique Rome. So let's finally get to the Babylonian Talmud and its descriptions of Cleopatra, especially those traditions that characterize her as an expert in the human body. And this is where some of the texts get a little dark. Now, 3 of the 4 rabbinic passages that mention Cleopatra paint a portrait of her as keenly interested in discussions of the human body. The passages have the rabbis citing Cleopatra's knowledge in discussions of nudity, obstetrics, gynecology, and embryology, and indicate that they are not only aware of some of the medical traditions attributed to the queen in late antiquity, but more importantly, they suggest that Cleopatra is imagined as an apt source and interlocutor for rabbinic discussions of the body. They have no problem citing her. The earliest rabbinic passage that refers to Cleopatra can be found in the Tosefta of Nida, dealing generally with purity issues. This is, let's say, generally speaking, dating to the 2nd or 3rd century CE. And it appears at the very end of a discussion of, again, impurity and miscarriages. The text is disturbing on a number of levels, including enslavement and medical experimentation without consent. The passage reads, Rabbi Ishmael said, a case concerning Cleopatra, the queen of Alexandria, who brought her enslaved women who were sentenced to death by the kingdom. She cut them open, and it was found that a male fetus finished developing on day 41 and a female fetus finished developing on day 81. In this passage, Rabbi Ishmael uses gynecological and embryological knowledge attributed to Cleopatra and her experiments in order to support his rabbinic ruling that the time of impurity for a woman who miscarries depends on the sex of the fetus. He is citing her like he might cite the book of Leviticus. According to Rabbi Ishmael, Cleopatra herself performed dissections or vivisections on condemned enslaved pregnant women in order to study embryology. The feminine singular verbs in the passage suggest that it is Cleopatra herself who is actually performing the dissections as medical expert. She brought and she cut. While this passage is dramatic, it seems to emphasize the utility of Cleopatra's gynecological and embryological knowledge gained directly through dissection for Rabbi Ishmael's argument. her data are not rejected. Rather, they are accepted by Rabbi Ishmael, seemingly without revision, or even attributed to anyone else. They could have just as easily attributed to someone else. And what's interesting is elsewhere in rabbinic texts, you actually have Rabbi Ishmael, or at least his students, also performing dissections to, especially on women's bodies, to study the number of bones in the body. Overall, the Tosefta Nida, in this passage, Rabbi Ishmael exhibits a familiarity with larger Mediterranean traditions of Cleopatra as a medical expert, or at the very least as knowledgeable of the body, and suggests that she was a reputable source for rabbinic legal arguments. I'm not going to read this out loud. It's just, this is the only way to provide it. We'll spend the rest of our time in the later rabbinic texts of the Babylonian Talmud, where one finds the remainder of allusions to Cleopatra. The dating of the Babylonian Talmud, its various layers, is complicated, but I'm going to generalize and say, let's say 6th century CE. The tradition of Cleopatra and embryology that I just discussed is also found here in the Babylonian Talmud, which adjusts some of the details from the Tosefta. While I will not read this passage for you, I will note a few of its particularities. First, in this passage, you actually find 2 different versions of the narrative of Cleopatra and embryology. The first section is marked in green, it's A through C, and the second version is D through E. So these are 2 different versions meant to stand side by side. And they differ, these different versions differ on whether the sages or rabbis or Rabbi Ishmael specifically agree with Cleopatra's findings. The first version, sections A through C, reverses the argument found in the Tosefta, with the sages claiming Cleopatra's experiment proved that all fetuses have the same gestational period, regardless of the sex they're born with. While the second version, D through E, has Rabbi Ishmael citing Cleopatra's experiment to prove that gestational periods are different if it's a male fetus or female fetus. So essentially, we have 2 rabbinic articles published in the same journal arguing against each other, and both articles cite Cleopatra's medical experiments as proof for why they are right. At the same time, we also find, and those that disagree, we find critiques of Cleopatra's methodology and the characterization of her as a fool when the rabbis disagree with her citation. So either Cleopatra is cited as proof they're right, or someone disputes that the group is right by saying Cleopatra's experiments were flawed. However, differences between this Talmudic passage and that of the Tosefta seem to exhibit a more developed attitude toward Cleopatra and her expertise in the Babylonian Talmud. The first major difference between the Talmudic passage and the Tosefta is the characterization of Cleopatra's methods. In the Tosefta, Cleopatra is described as actually cutting. The verb kara, which might more accurately be translated as tearing or ripping into the woman's bodies. A much more violent act than the description of her examining bodies in the Talmud, which uses the G-stem verb badak. The verbal root badak is used elsewhere in the Babylonian Talmud to refer to proper rabbinic examination done by good rabbis or sages, including the examination of witnesses, the examination of rocks, and the examinations of women's bodies. Rivka Almer rightly points out that the Talmud's change in verb means Cleopatra is depicted in a less violent way. But I might push this further. In this passage, Cleopatra performs examination in a way that resembles the rabbis. She is examining just like the rabbis do, with the same verb. Further evidence for a more, let's say, favorable view of Cleopatra, maybe not by our standards, but in the Babylonian Talmud, and the utility of her knowledge in the Talmud can be found in both versions' exchanges between Rabbi Ishmael and the sages, in which both parties justify Cleopatra's methods in response to the other party claiming the evidence of Cleopatra should not be cited because she's foolish. For example, in response to Rabbi Ishmael claiming Cleopatra's subject, essentially one of the impregnated enslaved women, was pregnant before the experiment got started, and thus Cleopatra has miscalculated the length of gestation. The sages claim in section C that Cleopatra used her medical expertise and knowledge of pharmacology to administer a scattering drug in order to remove semen from the woman and assure the quality of her study. In the second version, Cleopatra is also described in section E as trying to control the circumstances of her study by imprisoning the women so that they could not engage in sex acts. Cleopatra's concern for her, and I hate using this term, experimental controls, is used in both instances in the Babylonian Talmud as evidence for why Cleopatra's knowledge and evidence are permissible in rabbinic legislation on menstrual impurity. Essentially, both versions of the Babylonian Talmud add details that further develop Cleopatra's expertise, an expertise that both parties, Rabbi Ishmael or the sages, in the versions acknowledge or reject. It is also important to note that the rejection of Cleopatra's data and the labeling of her as a fool in each of the versions by either Rabbi Ishmael or the sages does not seem to be due to the data being collected by someone who's not part of the Jewish community, but is because Cleopatra's experiment was compromised according to rabbinic standards. Overall, one finds a less antagonistic view of the queen's embryological data and expertise in the Babylonian Talmud compared to the earlier tradition found in the Tosefta. Cleopatra acts as an expert in embryology, and through citation of Cleopatra, Rabbi Ishmael and the sages are able to argue about it and to further their own argument. Related to these passages on Cleopatra's embryological expertise is a sugya from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin 90b, which describes a Talmudic dialogue between Cleopatra and Rabbi Meir on whether one is clothed or naked when resurrected. The text reads, Queen Cleopatra asked Rabbi Meir and said, I know that the dead will live, for as it is written, may they blossom from the city like grass of the earth. A citation of the book of Psalms. But when they rise, she asks, will they rise naked or will they rise with their clothes? Rabbi Meir said to her, it is a kal vachomer based on wheat. If wheat that is buried naked rises in many clothes, then the righteous who are buried in their clothes, all the more so, which is essentially saying, if wheat is buried naked and sprouts with clothes on, then you'll resurrect with clothes on if you're righteous. The text is but one of many imagined conversations between rabbis and non-Jews about resurrection in the Babylonian Talmud's tractate Sanhedrin. In their brief dialogue, Cleopatra asked Rabbi Meir about the issue of clothing, but significantly, and unlike other rabbinic discussions with non-Jews elsewhere in the tractate, Cleopatra cites scripture, specifically Psalm 72. For Cleopatra, there is no question of whether resurrection happens or is even derived from Torah, questions which are extensively debated elsewhere in the tractate. Cleopatra explicitly says, I know, in regard to the body being resurrected, citing Psalm 72 as her proof. Because of this knowledge, she dives deeper into the details of that resurrection, specifically the question about clothing. Rabbi Meir then answers Cleopatra's question about clothing by citing the same verse from Psalm 72, using a kal vachomer, which is basically from minor issue to major issue. If it applies to a minor issue, then it has to apply to a major issue. To basically argue that the righteous will be resurrected fully clothed. While Omar has primarily understood this passage as a critique of Egyptian conceptions of the afterlife, resurrection, funerary rites, or Cleopatra's sexuality because of the nudity, I think one finds in this passage another instance of rabbinic admittance of Cleopatra's knowledge and further use of that knowledge toward promoting rabbinic concepts. As I have argued today, the Talmud has already shown Cleopatra to be a capable contributor to rabbinic discussions on the human body. The Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 90b also characterizes Cleopatra as an engaged interlocutor on the body, especially compared to rabbinic interactions with other figures. The Sanhedrin passage elsewhere speaks of various non-Jews interacting with rabbis on the issue of resurrection, including the Romans, an emperor, just generically Caesar, the emperor and the emperor's daughter. In these passages, all of these non-Jewish figures, save Cleopatra, question either resurrection or God's ability to control it, with the rabbis citing Torah or using analogy to show how incorrect the Romans, the emperor, or the emperor's daughter are. When comparing Cleopatra's interaction with the rabbis against other non-rabbinic figures of the passage, one notes some major differences. First, none of the other figures cite scripture in their argument. And even the ones that kind of do, even though they don't, what they're doing is they're being like, are you sure you're reading, Rabbi, are you sure you're reading that biblical passage correctly? Like, this is Caesar saying that to him. And Cleopatra appears to cite scripture appropriately and towards the right purpose by at least Rabbi Meir standards. Indeed, Rabbi Meir does not have to correct Cleopatra's reading of Psalm 72. Rather, he shows her further applications of it. In the rabbinic purview, she reads the verse correctly, but does not see the application of the verse to the question of clothing until Rabbi Meir explains it to her. Second, Cleopatra not only acknowledges the resurrection of the dead, but also acknowledges that there is scriptural proof for it, which is what the larger rabbinic passage is specifically arguing for. Cleopatra is thus distinguished from the other non-Jews and some Jews in the Babylonian Talmud because of her knowledge of Torah and her support of the rabbinic concept of resurrection. As Jenny Labens has argued, rabbinic texts do not seem to disqualify non-Jews from engaging with Torah, and some texts suggest rabbinic acceptance of non-Jewish medical knowledge. But Cleopatra is not just one of these non-Jews. She's a figure already renowned in late antiquity for her knowledge of the human body. And the rabbis admit to this knowledge and see Cleopatra as contributing to and further authorizing their larger project. Now, one possible reason for the insertion of Cleopatra and her expertise into the dialogues of Sanhedrin of the Babylonian Talmud is the importance of the concept of resurrection to the rabbinic project. According to Christine Hayes, resurrection is a particular source of anxiety for the rabbis because, one, the Mishnah declares it to be a fundamental belief, denial of which deprives one of life in the world to come, and two, it is nevertheless not found in the Torah. Cleopatra's reputation as an expert in the human body and possibly the association of the afterlife with ancient Egypt, although I'm cautious of this, make her the ultimate expert used by the rabbis to affirm resurrection. This is especially the case when one considers Cleopatra's non-Jewishness. If a famous non-Jew affirms not only the world to come, but also its inclusion in the Torah, then how could that not be true? The queen, her acknowledgement of resurrection, her citation of Torah, and her engagement with Rabbi Meir, who is also a descendant of according to the Talmud, of a famous Roman emperor, all point to, I lost my place. All point to, at the very least, a less antagonistic rabbinic reception of Cleopatra and the Talmud than has previously been found, and in my view, actually respect for Cleopatra and her expertise. Indeed, Christine Hayes has rightly suggested that because the Mishnah argues that anyone who denies resurrection will not enter the world to come, the Babylonian Talmud has to place opinions doubting resurrection in the mouths of outsiders. However, the presentation of Cleopatra as affirming resurrection and its inclusion in the Torah actually brings her closer to the rabbis. If non-Jews have to say resurrection's not in the Torah, resurrection's not real and not in the Torah, then Cleopatra's closer to the rabbis than even other Jews in this passage. Cleopatra might even be imagined as a colleague, maybe not one on equal footing with, say, Rabbi Meir, but because of her expertise in the body, she provides knowledge that the rabbis find useful and authoritative, at least enough to study. Oh, okay. The question remains as to why Cleopatra is characterized as an expert in the body in the Babylonian Talmud. Scholars like Charlotte von Robert, Mira Ballberg, and Rafe Neese, among others, have already shown how rabbinic texts construct rabbinic men as knowledgeable experts on and authorities over the human body, especially women's bodies. So why does Cleopatra get to be an expert when other women, particularly Jewish women in rabbinic texts, cannot? Rabbi Ishmael and the sages could have just as easily attributed Cleopatra's gestational knowledge to Galen or any other male figure who elsewhere expressed similar views regarding the gestation of fetuses, or even not similar views on the gestation of fetuses. Part of the answer lies in Cleopatra's rich reception history as medical expert in late antiquity. and the other in Cleopatra's status as non-Jewish. She can be an expert because she is outside the rabbinic authoritative landscape, and thus her knowledge does not directly threaten rabbinic authority. Rather, Cleopatra and her famed expertise can support it. It's at this point that I will turn to the last passage in which Cleopatra is mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud. But first, a little summary. As I've argued thus far, the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud use the figure of Cleopatra and her reception in the late ancient world in order to forward their own goals and concepts, particularly with regard to medical traditions. I now turn to the final passage that mentions Cleopatra and investigates whether the Babylonian traditions of Cleopatra as an interlocutor can illuminate a rabbinic political appropriation of the queen. So the Babylonian Talmud contains, this is the last reference to Cleopatra, and found in a discussion of the Roman festival known as Criticis, and why the rabbis prohibit interacting economically with non-Jews on and around the festival. The passage of Avodah Zarah in part reads, Criticis? What is Criticis? Rav Judah said in Samuel's name, the day in which Rome seized dominion. But have we not been taught in a Baraita, which is an earlier tradition, rabbinic tradition not found in the Mishnah, Criticis and the day in which Rome seized dominion? Essentially, if there's an and, then how is Criticis the day they seized dominion? Rav Joseph said 2 times Rome seized power, once in the days of Cleopatra the queen, and once in the days of the Greeks. According to this passage, the Roman festival Criticis commemorates the establishment of Roman rule. And then we, again, also find a question of whether there's also another date of when Roman power was established. Rav Joseph's answer that, again, briefly mentions Cleopatra, claims that Roman power was established twice. And one of those times was in the lifetime of Cleopatra. And these 2 events of Roman power being established twice are celebrated every year on the Roman festivals of Criticis and the Calends of January. It's weirdly complicated for a festival origin story. The reference to Cleopatra in the Babylonian Talmud is conspicuously absent from the Palestinian Talmud's treatment of the origins for Roman festivals. Avodah Zarah, Palestinian Talmud's Avodah Zarah reads, and Criticis, the day on which Rome seized dominion, and was it not already taught? Essentially, didn't we already know when Rome seized dominion? That's not Criticis. Rabbi Yosei ben Rabbi Boone says a second time. It's essentially the same thing with different names attached to it. According to this passage, the Roman festival of Criticis commemorates the establishment of Roman rule. An issue arises, though, because the Palestinian Talmud just previously discussed the origin of a different Roman festival, the Calends of January, that could also be traced back to the establishment of Roman rule. So which is it? Is the Calends of January the establishment of Roman rule, or is it Criticis? Again, this is solved by saying Rome seized dominion twice. But most important for our discussion is that Cleopatra is nowhere to be found in the Palestinian Talmud's explanation for the origins of these festivals. Based on the similarities between the Talmud's Palestinian and Babylonian discussions of these Roman festivals, as well as the lengthy additions in the Babylonian Talmud, Alyssa Gray has argued that the Babylonian Talmud's version actively expands on those found in the Palestinian Talmud. The addition of Cleopatra to the brief statement in the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud is part of this expansion. So essentially, Cleopatra is actively added in the Babylonian Talmud's version to oversimplify it. In tandem with the other Babylonian Talmud discussions of Cleopatra, it appears then that the Babylonian Talmud, more than any other rabbinic document, shows a keen interest in the queen and her persona and in the queen and her persona, and actively adds her to some traditions, including the one here about Criticis. But why? Why would the Babylonian Talmud add Cleopatra in its discussion of Roman festivals, especially compared to the Palestinian Talmud, which actually has Rome like more in its sights? References to Cleopatra, or even the lack of references to Cleopatra in Roman and other literature, can serve a multitude of purposes. For example, the Octavia, a Roman drama by an unknown author dating to just after the death of the Julio-Claudian Emperor Nero, does not mention Cleopatra in its presentation of the civil war between Antony and Octavian. Lauren Donovan Ginsburg argues that the Octavia subverts many texts that were part of the Julio-Claudian propaganda, such as Virgil's Aeneid, in order to critique and problematize Julio-Claudian notions of peace. Cleopatra figures into this critique in that the author chooses to remove her from discussions of the war between Octavian and Antony, so the focus remains entirely on the rival Roman leader, reminding us that the ultimate threat to Augustus's empire came from within Rome's political structure, not from a foreign foe. Now, while the Octavia is different in so many ways from the Babylonian Talmud, whether it be their languages, dates, redaction, authorship, among so many other features, the strategic inclusion or exclusion of references can similarly serve political purposes in the Babylonian Talmud, especially when those references have such a rich afterlife in the late ancient world like Cleopatra does. The Babylonian Talmud's discussion of Rome's rise to power explicitly adds Cleopatra by name, and I've tried to highlight it, underline it in this manuscript of the Babylonian Talmud. They forego references to Octavian or his, the later Augustus, Mark Antony, Agrippa, or any other Roman figures. And to reuse the wording of Donovan Ginsburg, the effect of this inclusion is, quote, so that the focus remains entirely on the rival to Rome, now Cleopatra. In doing so, I suggest that the rabbis elevate Cleopatra and remember her actions as enemy of Rome. One effect of this elevation of Cleopatra is the empowerment of one of Rome's primary political enemies, at least in memory. The empowerment of Cleopatra is actually rather explicit in the passage. The only individual with power is Cleopatra, expressed via the Semitic root malak, as only she is referred to as queen or Malkatha. And this naming of Cleopatra as queen is consistent throughout rabbinic literature and in all manuscripts that I have access to. In all passages, she is Queen Cleopatra, not just Cleopatra, an acknowledgement of her stature. Even if the entity she rules varies, as you can see here, she's either queen of Alexandria or the Greek queen, or just there's no entity ruled. The consistent naming of Cleopatra as queen also points to her reputation in the ancient world. Queen Cleopatra is queen of Egypt, famed enemy of Rome, and scholar. Indeed, it seems that the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud textually try to restore Cleopatra to her rightful place as queen, in opposition to the wicked empire of Rome. Interestingly, Zenobia is also explicitly titled as queen in the Palestinian Talmud, while her husband Odaenathus, as I mentioned earlier, is not given any title. The Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds very rarely give the title of queen to named individuals outside characters from the Hebrew Bible. In my very brief look at this, the only ones listed that I could immediately find are Cleopatra, Zenobia, the famously pious and possible convert Helena of Adiabene, as well as the Hasmonean queen Salome Alexandra. Although more research is necessary, it appears that the title of queen is reserved by the rabbis for a certain few. And putting Cleopatra and Zenobia in the same category as Helena of Adiabene and Salome Alexandra certainly says something about their rabbinic reception. Let's see here. Yeah, I think I did that right. Yeah. Overall, the Babylonian Talmud shows an interest in Cleopatra not seen in other rabbinic documents. Though references to her are limited, she makes the most appearances in the Babylonian Talmud, and these passages seem to elevate, engage with, and actively include the Egyptian queen. She's less cruel and more systematic medical expert in the Babylonian Talmud's Nida passages, and is explicitly added to the etiologies of Roman festivals in Avodah Zarah. Unlike the Hasmonean queen Salome Alexandra, who Tal Alan has argued is actively eliminated from the Babylonian Talmud, Cleopatra is actively added. The question remains as to why the Babylonian Talmud, divorced in part from Roman hegemony, would emphasize Cleopatra more than any other rabbinic document, especially compared to the Palestinian Talmud. One possible explanation is the continued sense of Rome as enemy in the Babylonian Talmud, where Rome still acts as a rabbinic quintessential other, a mythic kingdom like Babylon in the Hebrew Bible and early Jewish literature, and in rabbinic literature still. It was the enemy and remained the enemy, even for Jewish communities far removed, or maybe not so far removed from its rule. What better way to express this eternal Rome than to affiliate textually with one of its most famous enemies? Cleopatra. And similar to the continued presence of Rome in later sources, so too did Cleopatra remain. Indeed, the continued reception of Cleopatra in late ancient and medieval traditions speaks to the productivity of her persona in rabbinic discussions related to the body and even Rome. Returning to the questions I asked at the beginning of this lecture, who can Cleopatra be and what could she do? I hope to have provided one of many answers to these questions because Cleopatra can be different and do different things for different groups. For the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud, Cleopatra could be what they needed her to be, and what she already in part was in the broader traditions of the Mediterranean and Near East, an expert in the body and enemy of Rome. And by drawing on those traditions, the rabbis are able to prove certain legal, theological, and political arguments. And using the Palmyrene Queen Zenobia as an exemplar, I hope to have shown how those living under and responding to Roman rule in late antiquity appropriated Cleopatra and her expertise as part of their own projects. I also hope to have shown what happens when we stop privileging Roman portraits of these rulers, or even classical portraits of these rulers. And only after doing this, we can ask ourselves, who can Cleopatra and any other rulers be to Jewish communities? And again, the answer is they can be what our ancient groups needed them to be, regardless of the historical circumstances. Thank you. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions for Professor Bonesho.
It's okay if I jump in.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to run out soon to get my kids, but thank you so much. This is so interesting. I don't really have so much a question, but more wanted to like talk to you a little bit about this idea of like the addition or removal of like Cleopatra, because I was interested by your mention of the Octavia. So of course in Horace 137, the Cleopatra ode, like we get the removal of Antony, right? So I guess I just am excited about this sort of prospect of addition, or I suppose there it's removal of someone else to serve a purpose. So I don't know, like how do you see like Horace fitting in, or like this poetic persona fitting in, I guess?
Yeah, and I would definitely defer to the scholars who know Horace better than I do. But the last time I read Horace, I always thought of it as and emphasizing that this is a war, not a civil war, but a foreign war.
Right.
So it's like it's exactly the opposite of what the Octavia is doing. And I mean, even I'm thinking of just the prevalence of names. Like, what does even, let's say someone doesn't know who Antony is, like when they're reading it, it sounds, I mean, it's Latin, right? It sounds like an inside struggle. And I think having like a more, whatever foreign might mean in the language difference, I think it's a matter of, what sides do you want to emphasize, and where do you want to place, where do you want to place emphasis on the meaning of the conflict, or where do you want to identify the author with?
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess what was making me think of Horace was actually the Historia Augusta quote. I think it was that where you brought up what Zenobia, was it Zenobia like saying something to Aurelian
Yeah.
and saying like, don't you know that Cleopatra deserves to die? That's like basically like the Horace ode starts off so negative, but then it ends on a sort of like, well, but she kind of did a cool thing, like
Yeah.
respect. So I saw like a similarity there too. So just sort of to your point, just curious.
And I think because you mentioned the Historia Augusta, I think that a lot of times, I mean, it happens more often with Cleopatra. For Zenobia, we don't have as many sources, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because of how negative a lot of the ones on Cleopatra are. But I think this idea that like the Historia Augusta is definitely negative about Zenobia, but it's definitely not as negative. Like depending on your like perspective reading it, I don't know. It doesn't sound that negative, because maybe I really like Zenobia. I mean, I do. But I think a lot of this reading traditional scholarship, reading rabbinic literature's approaches to Palmyra, or Jews' approaches to Palmyra and Zenobia, they're like, well, of course the rabbis have to hate the like ruling queen of Syria. Of course they hate foreign queens, when in reality, I don't see that there. Yeah.
And-
There's a presumption of opposition when in reality, I think we're making it up,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
no,
we're
thank
looking
you.
for opposition.
This is
Yeah.
So interesting. Thank you so much.
Since we're talking about Latin literature and to further hijack the talk. So first of all, that was so interesting, Kate. I love the talk. To what extent is Dido active in the background here, right? Like, because I mean, in all the sources from like Virgil to even the Historia Augusta, right? She is mentioned. I saw her on the screen as sort of the other model that Zenobia apparently emulates, right? And I mean, there are the obvious similarities between Dido and Cleopatra. It's sort of the semi-foreign ruler in an African region who meddles with magic, right? And I don't know in your context how similar magic and medicine are, but in the Greco-Roman context, they tend to be quite similar. And then Dido has the added advantage, so to speak, of being from the same part of the world, right? Like of speaking a Semitic language and being Phoenician in origin or something. So is there any indication that the association, sort of the mirror imagery between Dido and Cleopatra helps the sort of authorization of Cleopatra in these texts that you
I think I actually don't, I did not do a search for this. I don't believe Dido shows up in any rabbinic texts, but I'd be willing to bet a large sum of money on that, but maybe not my life. But I didn't. But I think because Jewish communities were actively ruled by the Palmyrene state, and that because the destruction of Palmyra was like really important, I think they probably have Zenobia more in mind. But Sarikatan Gribitz has showed, especially in relation to the Palestinian Talmud's Avodah Zarah, that the rabbis are aware of like active like Roman sources. Like they might even know Livy. So I think that they're probably, they might have it in mind, but I think it's less explicit for them than Cleopatra and Zenobia are, but it's probably there. You do have, although it's unclear who did it, you do have like graffiti of the Aeneid in Judea, or I don't know. I think they're difficult to date. They're either just after the destruction of the temple or date to the Bar Kokhba revolt. So like maybe there's some knowledge, but or it could be a Roman soldier. So I don't really know what. Yeah, I tend to think it's a Roman soldier. I would love for it to not be a Roman soldier though. I think it's book 6 of the Aeneid that's in there too.
That's still a way that you can get knowledge of the Aeneid. It can be a
Yeah,
Roman soldier just
true,
hanging
yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean because it would actually make it even easier for them to see these traditions and like push back against
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm gonna now check if Dido's in there. Yeah, thank you.
If I can, we have a question on Zoom from Professor Kamra Eskenazi, who, Professor Eskenazi, you should be able to speak to us now. Can you speak?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. This was great. Thank you very much. Greetings from Los Angeles and a neighbor. I want to push back on the issue of the resurrection. I don't think Cleopatra supports that resurrection is from the Torah because she's citing the Psalm. The rabbis, when they try to prove it's from the Torah, they're struggling with the narrow sense of the Torah, the first 5 books. That's where the debate is. They're not, they're aware that both Daniel and Ezekiel mention resurrection. The question is it in the first 5 books? So her quoting Psalm doesn't actually help. So I think maybe that piece of your wonderful talk may be nuanced a little differently.
Thank you so much. That's very fair. I think I have maybe taken too wide of an approach to seeing her and her citation of it, because her saying I know that that there essentially that there's resurrection, or that there is a world to come, trying to find a basis in scripture for it. But you're right, it is technically it's not like written Torah. Yeah, that's a very fair point. Thank you so much for that. And hi in LA.
Daniel.
I actually wanted to ask about that particular passage as well. So do you want to go back to the Bavli Sanhedrin 90b?
5:30, if that helps. Yeah. Yeah, I know that the deadline.
Yeah, so anyways, my question is, that language actually sounds a lot like the polemic in the Gospels where Jesus is challenged, right? And we have both aspects, that we know and citation of scripture when Jesus is challenged and is presented as a trap. You know, so that we know is we don't know. We dispute you on this in that case, right? So I'm wondering if there is a bit of a stereotype form of disputation going on, which is really questioning, but in the form of citing scripture. So I'm not, like, right off the bat, I don't necessarily take her citation of scripture in the I know as positive towards resurrection. Can it also, I mean, I'm in danger of reading, you know, a passage of the Gospels into this, but I'm just struck by how similar the language is. And there, the dispute is exactly over resurrection again.
Actually, there is like a dispute format. The most famous example I can think of is Mishnah Avodah Sarah 3:4, where a rabbi and a stereotypical non-Jewish named guy, Proclos ben Philosophos, are at a bath of Aphrodite, and Proclos is like, hey, how could you be here? Doesn't it say you can't be, like, it's a harem that needs to be destroyed? And then the rabbi says, it's a rule of Torah to not give, I'm so bad at remembering like the exact details, but he's essentially saying there's a Torah rule that I cannot give rulings in a bath, which is in and of itself a ruling in a bath. They leave, and then the rabbi basically says it doesn't count as an idolatry because the bath of Aphrodite, even though there's a statue of Aphrodite, doesn't count as idolatry because it's not a temple, it's a bathhouse. And the reason it doesn't count as a temple is because you're naked in a bathhouse, and he literally says, and you're urinating in front of a statue of your god. And if that's your temple, then implied there are maybe bigger issues than you guys have. So he's basically saying, I can go to a bathhouse where there are idols, like you are reading scripture wrong.
Yeah.
But it's an actual, I have to look it up, but it's an actual question, like it's a question there with it, like there's a citation of scripture and a presumption that they're interpreting it wrong by the non-Jew. And here, unlike the other Sanhedrin passages, it's just so different that she's citing it and agreeing with that the resurrection exists, because everyone else is like, no resurrection, and there's no I knows.
Yeah.
Although I'd have to look more.
Yeah.
But I didn't think of the New Testament.
Yeah. So it's in all four Gospels that you have that language. Like Mark had Mark 12 something, Matthew 22 something. Right? Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
I'll ask a question if I'm not displacing anyone. Thank you so much. Brilliant and such fascinating material. It's so interesting that Cleopatra and Zenobia are mentioned in the same breath as Helena, because we have from Josephus a very elaborated story of the conversion of the ruling house of Adiabene to Judaism, and Helena is a very important figure in this. Simcha Gross has a new article where he argues that we've approached that conversion story in the wrong way. This is not some kind of totalizing theological commitment on the part of that ruling house. This is a matter of political positioning, and it is what you do when you are a border kingdom between the enormous imperial spheres of Rome on the one side and Iran on the other, and you are negotiating between them, and you are trying to carve out and win new constituencies for your cause. And so there is a huge Jewish community on both sides of the Euphrates River, in both the Roman Mediterranean and in Iran. And so all sorts of rulers must have had various reasons to court that constituency. Adi Bain certainly did, and surely Palmyra did in the short-lived days of its breakaway empire, and surely Cleopatra did as well. And so the connection and even the mention that Zenobia may have been a convert or whatever, who knows and who cares about the actual historicity of that? But that is the kind of story that might get around. That's a message that she might have wanted to project to court constituencies in Persia and in the Roman Empire as well.
Yeah.
So by the time you get to late antique Iran and to the rabbis who are redacting the Babylonian Talmud, is there a real kind of political memory of those sorts of efforts to court Jewish constituencies, or is it just this tradition? It's like a distant memory, and the political stuff is mostly irrelevant.
I think so Zenobia only shows up in the Palestinian Talmud, so I think that is maybe far, I believe Palmyra only again shows up in the Palestinian Talmud for the most, but there might be some exceptions, but they're like generic term citation of that one Bible passage that may refer to Tadmor. So I think for Zenobia, it's maybe lost. I think Helena of Adiabene she has a persona, right? She, like Cleopatra, she has a persona that like outlives her, not importance, because she's important, but that has an afterlife of its own. And Sri Ketan Gribetz has done really great work recently on the memory of Helena of Adiabene in Jewish texts. I mean, there's even like either a street or a square for Helena of Adiabene in Israel right now. There's not one for Cleopatra that I know of. And I think generally speaking, the memory of the political importance for Cleopatra is something that you see more broadly throughout the Near East. I mean, even in like the medical texts, you see it in Syriac, the full Syriac biographies and histories. So I think Cleopatra shows up more because it's more far-reaching, and because she's this like eternal enemy. She's kind of like, if we use the Esau and Jacob trope of like rabbinic texts of Esau as Rome. Well, if Esau is Rome and Cleopatra is the enemy of Rome, it puts her closer to Jacob, right? And doesn't mean she's a rabbi, but it's for someone that's an Egyptian queen, she's pretty damn close from what I can tell. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty. I'm gonna look up something.
A question? Fascinating talk. I'm fascinated by a different aspect of her talk, which is the reception of Cleopatra. Before your talk, I wasn't aware of her mention in these later sources. And I'm very impressed by how they saw her as both a symbol of resistance to Roman rule and Roman enemy, and also a reliable source of medical knowledge, which fascinated me, because they're also mentioned in ancient sources of her conducting experiments on sentenced prisoners to test poison before she was able to commit suicide. She wanted to, I guess, find the most painless way to go. But so it's amazing how I think all these sources agree she's conducting this experiment on prisoners who are sentenced to death but still alive. And she seemed to have no qualms about doing this alive, people who are still alive. And also because the Ptolemaic royal family, they sponsor, scholarly research at the museum, the Library of Alexandria, and some people who conduct their research there, they, I think there are mentions of how they dissect
Like the
cadaver.
Herophilians.
Yeah.
Herophilius.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if she actually, historical Cleopatra might have some kind of acquire some knowledge in human anatomy from that. And also because since the very early on, the Egyptians have a reputation for their advanced medical knowledge. I wonder if that has anything to do with their practice of, mummification.
May I roll this in with Professor Marshall's question, which you typed in? Do you know of any connection with the tradition of Herophilus and Erasistratus? That's right, the anatomist who made practice for the section in the Ptolemaic court of Alexandria.
Same question. Thank you.
Same question.
Wonderful. So if I'm remembering correctly, the Galen passage where he talks about Cleopatra, I'm like a certain Cleopatra. I'm gonna say that because I don't think it's the Cleopatra. There are, again, many of them. I believe the person he's mentioning there, people have connected to be a student or like descendant or student in the tradition of Herophilus. So and it's in part because of the dissections part, because unlike the empiricists, they were very okay with dissection predominantly of people they saw as lesser. There has been, I think, I can't remember if it was Laura Newton who said this, so I might be quoting the wrong person, please forgive me, a discussion of, is the location of Ptolemaic Egypt the reason why we see a rapid increase in the acceptance of dissections or vivisections? And what is it in relation to conceptions of like local Egyptians against the, elites of Ptolemaic Egypt? I don't know. But it's interesting that the Talmud seems to really not be okay with dissection, except for Rabbi Ishmael, who cites Cleopatra's dissections. Maybe his students. There's a whole debate as a rabbinic conception of pikuach nefesh, like you preserve life no matter what. And there's a question of if someone is a terminal, like a terminal disease, and someone murders someone with a terminal disease, theoretically, there's a debate, I think it's in the Babylonian Talmud, of whether or not the person who did the murdering should be put to death because they killed someone who's already dying. So it's not a life for a life. There's a whole debate. And then there's a discussion, well, how do you determine if someone is terminal or not? And then they talk about autopsies. And then they said, well, it's better to not put the person to death, but don't do an autopsy because it messes with God, the body that God created. So like they really don't want to do autopsies, except for, much like most rabbinic texts, when they do perform them, or when they do talk about doing it. Rabbi Ishmael's students want to find out the number of bones in the human body, and they so they boil the corpse of a sex worker, and they find 4 more bones than they expect normal, and they actually say like normal or normative body, and then they explain, well, the sex worker has to be a woman because women have 4 more bones. They have 2 doors and 2 hinges for the womb. So they're just playing with it at times, but it's always someone else at that, like it's another group that they're doing it to. I don't know, does the Romans do something similar? Like when Galen does it, I should look that up. When Galen does autopsies, how does he do that? I mean, he brags about it, doesn't he? Galen. But why don't they talk about, like, Babylon could just say Galen did it. I mean, that would be not that weird.
Yeah, seems like Egyptian pharaohs are not only heard, there's also mentioned, I think it was in Herodotus, of a 26th dynasty pharaoh, Psammetichus. He wanted to determine which human language is the oldest. So he basically locked up 2 newborn babies together and forbid anyone from speaking with them. And then eventually the babies developed their own word and language, like Beko or Beko, something like that. And that's the Phrygian word for
bread, yeah.
bread. And so he decided, okay, Phrygian language is the oldest in the world.
Well, I have never heard of that text, and now I have to go find it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Question.
Can I ask another one? Given that the rabbis are hardly feminists.
Yeah.
The way that they treat Cleopatra and Zenobia here, and in particular, presenting Zenobia in a more rich way than her husband. I'm wondering if this is a way of emasculating Rome, or it's a sort of so rather than seeing that as something that they really want to say about these women, it tells us more about how they really want to see whoever that text is against.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I know that traditionally, the idea that the rabbi, because there's a passage of, we shouldn't be sad when Palmyra falls because they were part of the destruction of the Second Temple. I think maybe they just really hate Odenathus, like, but the fact that they use his Aramaic name is significant in and of itself, because they don't use Zenobia's, they use her Greek name. I've always wondered why they hate him so much, but in the story, I guess that they actually make fun of Odenathus as well. They talk about how she's the real, like she's, I hate the metaphor, but she wears the pants in the relationship, to use modern metaphors. Right? That's what, yeah, they basically talk about how masculine she is in their traditional stereotypes. So they could be responding to that. But yeah, you're right, they're definitely not like women should be ruling everything.
yeah.
I think they might just hate Odenathus or critiquing.
Yeah.
But if they critique Roman masculinity, then one would hope they'd also see it as part of themselves. But maybe that's me being too naive about how they read things. Yeah, it's a great question. I never Odenathus is I wish we actually knew more about him in terms of the literary representations. Yeah.
I have another just as a very minor question though. When they say Rome conquered us twice, once in the time of Cleopatra and once in the time of the Greeks, huh?
Yeah.
They had referred to, or at least one of the passages, as a Greek queen.
Yeah. What they're talking about essentially Hasmonean times, but they get a lot of scholars focus on how they get the numbers of the dates wrong. But I think that's not their goal isn't to tell correct Hasmonean history. It's basically trying to come up with two origin stories that talk about how Rome is powerful and mean and terrible. And to connect it to the past. My favorite version of this, granted it's in the Palestinian Talmud, is they connect the foundation of Criticis in the Palestinian Talmud and the longer passage to every time in the Hebrew Bible Israel sinned, something happened, an important milestone in Rome. So like I can't remember the exact, maybe the two calves, like the golden calves, that's Romulus and Remus. Like, so in retaliation for one is every time you sin, Rome gets bigger.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's when was it Elijah leaves in a whirlwind? Guess who also leaves in a whirlwind? Romulus. Yeah, so it's like literally tit for tat, kind of in terms of the foundations. But they also, again, they really show that they do know a lot of things unsurprisingly, about Roman religion and Roman practices. Like they know different calendrical terms. They know calends. They know dies ater. So they do know a lot more than I think has traditionally been.
But you think there's no reference to a particular moment in that?
It's later explained as different moments by, I think, different interpreters of the Talmud, but it's generally in the Hasmonean period. But the dates later on, they'll give the exact numbers, but the numbers literally don't add up. Okay. But for them, it's just a matter of it's still that moment. Yeah.
Isn't that the Pompeian reduction of Syria?
Yeah, that's what I would have wondered. Yeah.
And Augustus.
But how is that in the time of the Greeks?
Well, Syria was Greek.
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah.
In the time of the Greeks.
Yeah.
There's a coin of one of Pompey's agents in this depicting Bacchius Judaeus kneeling as a suppliant to Rome. I don't know who Bacchius Judaeus is, but maybe a representation of the high priest.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a very definite awareness on the Roman side.
Yeah.
I think they also seem, in later texts, again, also in the Babylonian Talmud, they're going to adopt the different passing of empires, like kingdom model found in like Daniel, but apply different. The kingdoms are no longer like Greece. The fourth kingdom is no longer Greece. It's going to be like it's Rome, and they're going to divide their periods. And Rome was going to start in different times. Yeah, but the importance is the actual origins of the festivals, and just, this is why you really shouldn't make sure you don't participate in Roman festivals, because they would have been popular. We actually have inscriptions of one guy in Phrygia who leaves a donation for, this is money I bequeath upon my death for the celebration, I think, of Passover and the calends of January. So like, obviously, like if they're like civic festivals, I don't know, I mean, calends of January, Saturnalia, they sound like fun. It's like sometimes the rabbis protest a little too much. You're wondering, you really have to talk people into not wanting to observe it. If that makes sense. Yeah.
They do the Christian thing and just like turn Saturnalia into Christmas and
Yeah.
and assimilate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's what in the Babylonian Talmud, they'll turn Saturnalia into a justification for Hanukkah. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, if there are no further questions, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you also to the Zoom audience, and most importantly, please join me in thanking Professor Bonesho.